The game you're about to see between Carlsen and Mamedyarov obviously got a lot of attention on day 3 from the World Rapid Chess Championship, and rightfully so, as it proved a stepping stone for Magnus on his way to wrapping up another Rapid title. But what I'd like to do here is paint the full picture, dive into the details, lift up the hood, and show that it wasn't necessarily a clinic put on in terms of how to play a minority attack structure for either player, and actually show that while they followed theory, in the most critical moments, perhaps the best plan wasn't chosen. Let's dive in and analyze it and perhaps give some educational takeaways for players of all levels, whether you play a queen's pawn game or otherwise, some pawn structure takeaways and some other critical tactics that will definitely help you in your own games. Let's take a review and dive in. Now, we have knight f3 and then the move c4. Not necessarily a queen's pawn game, but it quickly transposes and we get a queen's gambit declined. As I defined it, the orthodox structure happens right here, right now. It's been called a Carlsbad, just queen's gambit, but what you get in this queen's pawns leading the way type of middle game is the structure you see after e3 and c6. So what's going on here? We have white playing with the 3 pawns facing the queen side. Add that to the fact that we have 2 versus 3 for black. That's called a minority attack. By definition, when you have a minority, that means you're missing a pawn. And in this case, it's the open file, the activity, and the pressure that really helps white's plan succeed. It's not the fact that these 2 pawns are all juiced up on steroids and going to go beat up the other 3. That's not how it works. It's the accuracy of how you apply the pressure using the open file and the timing of which you advance these pawns that really earns white his stripes when playing this type of position. A little bit of foreshadowing right now to what happened in the critical moment. Now for black, what's going on is you have 3 pawns facing the center of the board. Now this is critical because it uses the e4 square and ultimately the e file as the launching pad for the attack to be successful on the king side. This is critical because it shows that both sides want different things in the game. Black would like to castle, put a rook on e8. If he likes it, he'll put a knight on it, and then maybe maneuver the other guy over here to help. In his dream fantasy world, everybody is partying on the king side at the white king's expense. So white doesn't want that to happen while he's just off chasing positional weaknesses and his king is getting checkmated. So that kind of sets the tone for what both sides want in these positions, and after the moves queen c2, castles, and bishop d3, we're getting all theory. Now, the move rook e8 is met by bishop f4, which I think for a lot of viewers at first seems kind of strange. Why are you wasting a tempo, moving a piece twice in the opening when your king isn't even castled yet? The main thing I want to highlight is what Magnus is doing here is actually a common idea in this structure. He wants to keep this bishop on the board, both to help defend the king side and to maybe exert some pressure over here. And he's willing to waste the tempo to do it because the move rook e8 has a very common threat in these types of positions. For example, if castles comes, now whether knight e4 works right away or not, eventually the knight is coming to e4. Let's say things like knight f8, rook b1. When this move happens, the tactics start to favor black. Here's what I mean. If you take on e4 with the knight, you actually lose a piece. I'm now forking your knight and bishop. If you take here, I win your bishop here. And if you take e7, I take with the queen, adding to my protection of the e4 pawn, and you're losing a piece. If ultimately that means you have to trade off this piece, opening up the e-file and clearing away space on this side of the board, what did I highlight earlier? That's exactly what black wants. So it's the idea that knight e4 is coming and that exchanges might have to happen on e7 that really bothers Magnus in this position, and it's why he's willing to waste a full tempo to back up the bishop a square to avoid the potential exchange that might happen between these 2 dark squared ministers. So knight f8, h3 is then played, a very common sort of high-class waiting move, I like to call it in these structures, because it's not the most useful move, but it frees luft for the king later on. It overprotects a square like g4. Maybe I keep my bishop, maybe I don't. This is a very, like I said, it's a useful high-class waiting move, right? Not the most direct move. And the other reason Magnus hasn't castled short in the line I gave is because even if knight e4 right away wasn't possible, I was just highlighting the educational point that if you're playing these positions for either side, you need to watch out for knight e4 because black does want that trade. But even if knight e4 wasn't possible in castles earlier, bishop f4 and h3 have another idea in mind. It's keeping castles long open, right? White has the idea, or at least he's kind of toying with the threat, that he might put the king on the queen side, rush the g-pawn, and let you tell the nightmare stories that happened later, right? So that kind of forces Black's hand to be more aggressive and to want to exchange some pieces. He plays bishop d6, getting the same minor piece exchange that Magnus tried to avoid when he backed up the bishop, but he's having to lose a little bit of time to do it, right? So that's kind of White's idea. You now trade, you do castle short, you give up on the idea of the attack on the king side with g4, but you put yourself in a good spot to be able to now focus on the minority attack. Why do I say that? Well, after knight g6 and rook b1, the fact that you are already threatening b4, meaning there's not a bishop and queen battery here kind of slowing down b4, White is getting b4 and maybe b5 very quickly in this position, and that gives White the edge. Again, if Black just sat around, if we just want to play fantasy chess just to show you the goal, when this pawn arrives on b5, you will either let me take you, which gives you a backward pawn, and after knight a4, I've got the c5 square, I've got the c6 pawn, lots of good stuff. If you take here, not only are you weakening d5, but you're bringing my pieces into the game. And if you push, very often the trade happens, and you're left with the IQP, isolated queen pawn, for those who don't speak Italian. So this is the idea, right? And that's what White wants. So far, I would say, even despite my opening comments to the video, Magnus has played this close to perfect. It's pretty much all theory, and hopefully my analysis on what both sides are thinking in this structure can help you play this opening for either side. But now in this moment, after bishop d7 and b4 is played, rook a to c8 played, preventing b5 because the knight is pinned. Okay, rook to c1, and then queen e7. This position has been played before, and Magnus plays the move that has been played before, but it doesn't mean it's the right move. That's my point. This was highlighted by other people who analyzed the game, and it was reviewed as, oh, they were just following theory. I don't really think so. This wasn't theory they were following because they knew the players were playing it right. This was them playing a structure that they've played many times, but it doesn't mean that they're about to make the most accurate move. And I think that's what was misleading by the way a lot of people thought about this position with the move b5. This was actually a mistake by Magnus. b5 was played, and after the capture happened, and the capture happened here, if not for the blunder played by Mamedyarov, this was not just a choice to get into an original position from previously followed games. This was a straight-up blunder by Mamedyarov. If not for this move, Black is actually in a great minority attack here. The reason is that b5 came prematurely. b5, while it did achieve the trade and the d5 pawn is weak, it really just walked right into the prime real estate that Black was ready to own. And if he had played the move rook to c7, I analyzed this position for a while as an international master and with an engine, and I think that Black is doing fantastic here. There's several variations to show. Just if you try to make obvious moves, like bring the other rook over to b1, you would want to do this in some minority attacks. Now you just lose material on knight e4 and the rook come to c8. If you play a move like queen to b3, overexerting your pressure, again, the c file comes into play, and White is actually in big trouble. Queen to b2 kind of makes sense. You remove the queen from the pin and allow you to play the move knight e2 after the double. But after the trade happens here, knight takes c1, the move b6, Black is actually in fantastic shape. There was a game, kind of obscure, not two top players that played this kind of position before. And the point is that in this position, rather than having, let's say, two weaknesses for Black that sometimes happens when White plays b5, White actually has an a-pawn weakness, and Black kind of has a 2-on-1 here if you really want to think about it like that. Combine that with the fact that moves like knight e4 are possible. Let's say if a4, knight e4, you can't even take d5 without me providing a fork here where I win the a-pawn and overwhelm your queen's duties to the knight. And Black is actually in fantastic shape. He owns the only clearly open file. He's got a very well centralized knight, and again, the long-term edge of a 2-on-1 might actually make the minority attack, not the minority attack, but just a bad minority where Black may end up with a queenside pass pawn. So if rook c7 had been played here, I think the best move for White is actually the move rook b back to b1 and just admit that you might be worse. Rook e to c8, you move the queen over. Something like queen to d7 I analyzed. The idea is at some point I still want to go for knight e4 if you move this guy. I've just got rooks very powerfully placed on the queen side. And again, I would look at this structure as more of a 2-on-1 majority for Black now than I would a minority attack for White. And that's kind of the main issue I have with Magnus's b5. So the best move here on that point of everything I highlighted about the structure was actually a much more patient move a4. Note, you'd love to play moves that stop knight e4. This is a plan that's coming for black in these structures a lot. But if you waste time with a move like knight d2, which sometimes is playable in these structures, that's exactly what black wants here. The knight leaving the king side allows things like knight h4, right? I know it seems weird to have a knight on the edge, but it's hitting the favorite spot over here. Then the other knight comes over here to the king side. Here comes queen g5. Here comes bishop takes h3. This is the stuff that black really wants in the minority attack. So knight d2 can't really be played to slow down knight e4. But that's why a4 is perfect, just to be a little more patient with b5. If black just sits on the position with a6, the whole difference is, now let's say we get the same kind of tactics, and you're thinking, Dan, what's the big difference here? Now black can play rook to c7. The difference is that now when I back up my queen and just go in for these trades in the endgame, now you just have two weaknesses. You have two horrible targets, and here, white is actually just clearly better. So it takes it from what was a 2-on-1 majority for black to just a two weaknesses to none for white. So a4 was really the more patient way, I think, for white to play the position and get an edge on the queen side with the minority attack. Again, this just shows that while these are two of the best players in the world, and I'm not qualified in any way to play chess at their level or provide criticism, but I do analyze chess games for a living and sometimes do videos. And the point is, this just shows that in rapid chess, sometimes you want to take the more direct approach, right? And I just don't think this was guys following theory. This was just being very direct in a minority attack kind of structure, and frankly, just misplaying the position with b5. And again, it worked out because of Mamedyarov's mistake here with knight e4, but rook c7, we may have had a different story. That's the point. So, knight e4 was played, and why is this a blunder? Well, really, it's not the miscalculation of the fact that on queen b2, he had to play knight d6 and give up the pawn. No, what Mamedyarov missed, and again, this is just me surmising and trying to calculate and think of how they would think. What he missed was that he couldn't take on c3. Because the point is, after takes, seems like this is just a straightforward trade, right? How could this be bad? You actually can't properly defend both pawns. Surprisingly, any move you play here, even queen d7, which attacks the rook and does the trick, is met by queen b3, which protects the rook and does the trick of a double attack. So I think the tactic Mamedyarov missed when he played knight e4 was that Magnus's simple queen b2 is like, uh-oh, yeah, I'm actually just going to lose a pawn here straight up, and trading on c3, I think that was his plan, doesn't even stop it because there's no way to deal with both of these weaknesses just on a tactical level. So I think that was the thing Mamedyarov miscalculated. He played knight d6 and gave up the pawn, and honestly, after that, it starts to become what is a Magnus Carlsen clinic, and kind of seemed that way, right? Magnus has won the d5 pawn, very, very direct now, accurately plays rook c5, which threatens knight c7. After rook d8, he just backs up, right? I've got my pawn, I'll get out of dodge now. h6, queen a3, going to continue to use my open lines on the queen side. Queen a5, queen to e8. Here comes queen to b6. Now this is getting surgical up in this. Thanks, Marcellus Wallace. King h7, rook d5, rook c8. We make a trade, and Magnus wins another pawn. This is just a bad sign, right? It's now two very, very healthy looking peshki here, and no tactics to go with it for black. Rook c1, king h2, rook c2. Rook d7, very accurate, grabs the 7th rank, and after king to g8, rook c7 forces a resignation, mainly because if you do anything else with the rook that isn't trading, I'm going to play rook c8 and win the queen, and if you do trade, the d-pawn is dirty dancing all the way up the d-file. So, back to that critical moment, I think the big takeaway again was just that b5, not as good as maybe first thought of or first suggested by people that reviewed the game, but really a4 would have been the much more disciplined, patient approach. And again, if black overcommits knight e4, which I didn't look at earlier, you have several options here. You can even just slide the queen over to b2. Again, you're patiently waiting to explode with b5, because any of these trades, if a6 doesn't happen, some random move, when this happens, not only do you still have d5 problems, but if you trade and take, in some positions I might even take with the pawn, and I have other weaknesses to go along with the d5 pawn. So again, a lot of reasons why getting that a pawn involved in the protection of b5 would have been good for Magnus, and I think this was the critical moment. It worked out when knight e4, the blunder came. Ultimately, it helped Magnus Carlsen on his way to winning the title. Look out for my final video on the World Rapid Chess Championship 2019, which was, of course, Carlsen's draw versus Nakamura in the last round. But hopefully, this really showed you more of the details of what was going on in this game. And leave a comment, leave a like, let me know how you're feeling, and I'll see you around on Chess.com.